one is a surprise. Okay, I said no surprises. Sorry.
You know, Mike was in a lot of trouble, man, and he had a publicist named Ramon Bain. And me and Mike was cool over the years, always hung out.
He built an empire on laughter. A sharp suit, a sharper mustache. A man who turned punchlines into millions. And the other, he wasn't just famous, he was myth. A voice that bent gravity, a body that moved like time itself had paused to watch. Steve Harvey, Michael Jackson. Two men, two completely different worlds. One made people laugh. The other made the world stop breathing. But here's what nobody asks. What happens when the funniest man in the room becomes the quietest witness to the most painful story in entertainment history? Because behind the glitter, behind the sold-out arenas, behind the headlines that screamed guilt before truth, there was a silence, a 20-year silence. And inside that silence, a man was breaking. Act 1. The Golden Cage. Fame doesn't free you. It refines your prison. For Steve Harvey, fame was survival, a ladder out of nothing. For Michael Jackson, fame was inheritance, a crown placed on a child before he understood the weight of it. The world saw Michael as untouchable, but the closer you got, the more fragile he looked. Steve saw it. Not the performer, not the moonwalk, not the glove, the man. And that's where the story changes. Because what made Michael Jackson famous was the very thing that trapped him: perfection. Every note had to land, every move had to stun, every appearance had to feel otherworldly. He wasn't allowed to be human. And when you're not allowed to be human, you don't learn how to survive like one. Steve Harvey understood survival. He lived it. Sleeping in cars, eating when he could, grinding through comedy clubs that barely paid enough to keep the lights on. But Michael? He never had cracked sidewalks. He had spotlights. And that difference, that gap, would define everything. Act 2. Back to the beginning. Back to the cracked sidewalks. Back to the noise. Back to the pressure. Steve Harvey grew up in Cleveland. Not glamorous, not forgiving. A father who worked hard, a household where nothing came easy. Pain wasn't optional, it was currency. You earned your place, or you got left behind. That's where Steve built his hunger. Not for fame, for escape. Every joke, every performance was a step away from a life that promised nothing. But Michael's story, different battlefield, same war. Back to Gary, Indiana, a small house, too many expectations, and one figure looming over everything: Joe Jackson. Not just a father, a drill sergeant. Discipline wasn't taught, it was enforced. Perfection wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. Mistakes had consequences. And when a child learns that love is conditional, they don't grow, they perform. Michael didn't chase greatness, he was chased by it. Every rehearsal, every correction, every moment under that watchful eye built the artist the world would worship and destroyed the child who needed protection. That was the debt. That was the promise. Be perfect or don't be loved. Act 3. The first collision. The Apollo Theater. A place where legends are tested, where applause isn't given, it's earned. This is where their paths crossed. Steve Harvey, still climbing. Michael Jackson, already untouchable. But something strange happened. There was no ego, no distance, just two men talking. And Steve noticed something immediately. Michael didn't speak like a king. He spoke like someone still searching, still asking, still unsure. How does the biggest star in the world sound uncertain? Because fame doesn't fix what's broken, it hides it. And behind closed doors, Steve saw glimpses. Not scandal, not chaos, but loneliness. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that whispers. The kind that follows you even in a crowd chanting your name. Act 4. The validation gap. Michael Jackson had everything: money, fame, influence beyond imagination. But there was one thing he never truly got: belief. Not applause, not admiration, belief. The world loved Michael Jackson, but it didn't trust him. And over time, that doubt became cultural, a narrative, a shadow that followed every move. Every friendship questioned, every decision analyzed, and eventually, every accusation amplified. The 2003 allegations didn't just challenge Michael's career, they challenged his existence. The trial became a spectacle, not a search for truth, a performance. And Steve Harvey watched it unfold, silently. Because sometimes speaking up isn't just risky, it's dangerous. Careers collapse over association, reputations dissolve overnight. And Steve had something he spent decades building, so he stayed quiet. But silence has a cost. Act 5. The psychological twist. How does the most famous man in the world become the world's most misunderstood? You start with isolation. Michael built a world around himself, Neverland, a place designed to feel like childhood, rides, animals, fantasy. To outsiders, it looked strange. To Michael, it was compensation. He wasn't recreating childhood for fun. He was trying to experience it for the first time. And that's where the world got it wrong. They saw odd behavior, but didn't ask why. They saw difference, but didn't ask what caused it. Trauma doesn't disappear when you grow up. It evolves. It reshapes your habits, your relationships, your sense of reality. Steve saw that. Not excuses, context. And context changes everything. Because suddenly, the richest man in the room was also the loneliest. Act 6. The silence. 20 years. That's how long Steve Harvey said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood the weight of what he'd say. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't commentary. This was testimony. And testimony changes history. So he waited, watched, carried the memories, until something unexpected happened. Not a journalist, not a producer, a child, his granddaughter. An innocent question, simple, unfiltered. Was he really a bad person? And just like that, the silence cracked. Because how do you explain complexity to innocence? How do you tell a child that the world sometimes gets it wrong? The truth isn't always loud enough to win. Steve couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not for headlines, for clarity. Act 7. The truth he saw. Steve Harvey didn't claim perfection. He didn't rewrite history. He didn't ignore controversy. He simply described the man he knew. Kind, soft-spoken, deeply misunderstood. A person who carried wounds most people never saw. And more importantly, a man who felt betrayed. Not just by the media, but by the world that once adored him. Because love, when it turns, becomes something else. Something colder, something sharper, something unforgiving. And Michael felt that shift. From icon to suspect. From genius to question mark. And once that transition happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Act 8. The final reflection. Back to the beginning. Back to the stage. Back to the moment everything could have gone differently. Two men, one learning how to survive, the other trying to understand why survival always felt so hard despite having everything. Steve Harvey walked away with lessons. Michael Jackson walked away with scars. And in the end, only one of them got the chance to explain their story. The other became the story. Conclusion. This isn't a tale of innocence or guilt. It's a story about perception, about how the world builds you up, then questions the very foundation it created. Steve Harvey didn't break his silence to defend a myth. He spoke to defend a memory, a human being behind the headlines. Because sometimes the loudest stories aren't the truest ones, and sometimes the truth waits